CERO Internet. Sean. That Star Wars, Back to the Future, Nostalgia UFO Conference, Laughlin. Okay, you have to check.
freedomslips.com. He was on 2 weeks ago. We had a lot of fun with him. But Preston Dennett is next week, and it's going to be good with the underground bases. So, questions? I'm in the back. I'll give you any information you need. Thanks. Thanks, Yvonne.
Thanks, Wendy. And there'll be a copy of the presentation tonight back there at Wendy's table available for you to take home. However, we do have to vacate this room by 10:30. So once we wrap up at 10, you can get your DVDs if you'd like to take them home. But I'd like to present our two speakers tonight because I have known these two gentlemen for a very long time. I've been in the field for 23 years, and I think I've known Ruben just as long. We had dinner last night, and it was just really nice to sit and talk. And then I met Noe, and they've been in Roswell with me as well. So you have all the cards here, and you read their wonderful bio. They're both with, Ruben is with State Director for Northern California, MUFON, and Noe is out of Texas, and he has been a UFO investigator with Texas MUFON. So I'm very, very excited. I think we've talked about you coming for about a year. Yeah. So they finally are here, and please give a round of applause for Noe and Ruben.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you. I see some familiar faces out there, and it's an honor being here with you folks tonight. And I've been working with Mr. Noe Torres for probably now 10 years, and more than 10, yeah. 2006, oh yeah. Well, anyway, we've been working very hard on various projects, and we've come up with a number of books. One of them you may be familiar with Mexico's Roswell. And we've been researching a number of other cases in the Southwest, but it's been really a pleasure working with Noe, and also, yes, up a little bit higher. How's that? Okay. So anyway, again, thank you so much for the invitation. I'll turn the mic over to Mr. Noe Torres.
It seems more.
Yeah, it does.
More than 10 years. We started in 2006, but it's been a wild number of years since then. So Ruben and I started off with a book called Mexico's Roswell, as he mentioned, and we went out and did a lot of interviews, and we were on the History Channel. Ruben was on the UFO Files. And he and I together were on the UFO Hunters. And at some point, after the whole Mexico's Roswell thing, Ruben was trying to get he kept trying to get my attention about this other case that he had amassed quite a lot of information about. And the case that we're going to talk about today, he had actually collected up a lot of documents from the past. This is a highly well-documented case that very few people know about, actually. And Ruben will have more to say about the origins of all those materials as we go on tonight. But he kept trying to get my attention. You know, we were going and doing filmings and doing all these projects related to Mexico's Roswell and our other 2 or 3 books that we did after that. And finally, I paid attention long enough to Ruben and what he was trying to tell me. And I actually looked through that massive accordion file of material that he gave me, which included letters from Dr. J. Allen Hynek, many other heavyweight UFO researchers of the 1960s and 70s. And I finally realized, like I said, there was finally a pause and there was silence to where I understood what Ruben had been trying to tell me for a couple of years. This is an incredible case that has received very little media attention. And so we, at that point, once he got my focus, which wasn't easy, we started on this book project a few years back. And this has actually been one of our top-selling books, and we keep getting asked questions about it. We just had made contact with somebody who works in military intelligence, and he said he heard us talking about this case on Coast to Coast and has been a devoted follower of the case since then. And so we keep hearing stories like this, continuously. So we hope you enjoy our presentation tonight on aliens in the forest. We're going to take you back in time first to Cisco Grove, California, which is a small community east of Sacramento. And the date was September 4th, 1964. So we're coming up on 50 years. And it's amazing that it's been that long, because Ruben and I have spent so much time looking into this case, talking to the witness, the principal witness, and looking at all the documentation from the case, that we have grown extremely familiar with it, and it doesn't seem like a 50-year-old case. It seems much more familiar. So just backtracking a little bit, our principal witness in this case is a wonderful gentleman who named Donald Shrum. If his health could at all permit him to travel and to do presentations, he would love to be here with us tonight, but he is in very poor health, unfortunately, and has been stricken by a number of ailments that cause him great difficulty in speaking. But we have been in communication with him all through the book publishing process, and we'll say more about that as we go on. So 50 years ago this September, near Cisco Grove, Mr. Shrum and two other companions, Tim Trueblood and Vincent Alvarez, went out hunting in the Tahoe National Forest east of Sacramento. And a unique set of experiences that they encountered that evening is what we're going to talk about today, as covered in our book. Just to give you a general overview as we begin the story of what the site looked like, here is a map, a terrain map of the area, and you'll see up where it says camp near the top. That's where Mr. Shrum and his two companions, Mr. Trueblood and Mr. Alvarez, set up camp initially upon arriving. They had a long weekend. They were taking a break from working at the plant. All three of them worked at the same plant in Sacramento, the Aerojet Corporation, which was involved in manufacturing missiles and rockets for the U.S. defense program. And they were all three Aerojet employees. So they had taken the weekend off. They had the weekend off, so they went down on Friday. They established a base camp here. And the UFO incident that we're going to talk about happened deep, deep down into the forest, into a very rugged area, wilderness area. Even today, it's very difficult to get to without a considerably long hike. And it's quite an arduous task to get there. So Donald Shrum at the time, our principal witness, and the gentleman who gave us the information for the book, was 26 years old, and he was employed by Aerojet. He was a welder. He actually welded on those missiles and rocket systems of the early 60s. He was a welder and a painter for Aerojet in their Sacramento plant. And it was very interesting because we were doing a conference recently, and Stanton Friedman was also one of our invited speakers. And during his presentation, it finally clicked that Stanton worked for Aerojet Corporation at around the same time that Mr. Shrum did. Stanton was, of course, on the engineering side of it, and Mr. Shrum was a welder primarily. So this is as you can see here in this map, it's kind of a sketch of the area. And once again, up here we have the camp that the three hunters initially established. And then down here is where Mr. Shrum spent a long and taxing night up in a tree while these strange entities gathered around at the base of the tree and caused him a lot of problems all night long. So that gives you, once again, the general feeling for the area. And we'll just start into Mr. Shrum's story, and then Ruben will have comments along the way. This is the actual tree, by the way, where Mr. Shrum spent close to 12 hours that night. And he was watching all around him these amazing creatures and this amazingly large UFO, which descended close by. And this is Mr. Shrum, although his image is rather indistinct in this picture, and the tree where he spent. Now, he climbed up pretty far up, and then toward the end of his encounter, close to daybreak, he had to go almost all the way up to the top, strapping himself with a military belt that he had on to the limbs and working his way up the tree. So the way this started, and we're going to start with our first video clip here in a moment, was the three hunters had gone, and it wasn't rifle season yet, so they went out hunting with bow and arrows, which they sometimes did. So because it wasn't rifle season and they wanted to go out hunting, so they were accustomed to using bow and arrows. So the only thing they had with them to defend themselves were bow and arrows. So bows and arrows. So the three hunters went to the Tahoe National Forest. They established the camp, as I mentioned earlier, and then they trekked down south of the camp toward where these trees are down here. So from the camp down this way. But along the way, the three hunters spread out, and eventually it was starting to get dark, and the three of them had agreed that if they didn't get back to camp before nightfall, they would just try to find a secure place to hole up for the night and then regroup in the morning back at the camp. So that was the general plan going on. Well, Mr. Shrum found himself by himself, and it was getting dark, and he had been aware that there had been bear attacks in the area. Bears had attacked hikers. And so he was looking for a place that was sheltered, like perhaps a rocky outcropping or some place that was secure. And but always in the back of his mind was that if he needed to, he could go up in a tree and strap himself with his belt, with his large belt, and just spend the night in the tree. And so he actually had gone up in the tree or was preparing to go up in the tree when he saw a light coming from a distance. And on this map, see if I can find my cursor. Okay, the light, Mr. Shrum was already in position right around here, and he noticed the light first coming in this direction. And he wasn't particularly concerned because it seemed to be just a passing craft of some kind, unidentified, but then it made a sweeping turn and started moving in his direction. Once again, he was down here. So that was when he became concerned, as we're going to hear the witness himself tell us in this video clip.
And then I saw a light. It looked like a lantern going up and down a trail, but then it came over the top of a tree, and I got kind of excited then because I thought it was a helicopter from the Forest Service, and I stood between two of the fires that I built on the rocks, and waved my arms and yelled and screamed, and finally that light started coming towards me. So I was really relieved then because I thought it was a helicopter still, until it got within, maybe 60 feet or yards. I'm not sure the distance at night. But it just hovered there with no sound. So then I panicked because I knew it was no helicopter. I thought it was something from outer space. But it looked like all I could see is about an 8-inch glow. So I thought it was just a little tiny, flying saucer. And then I kind of panicked, and I threw my bow up in the tree again and hand walked out that limb and got up in the tree. And I had all camouflage clothing on, so I figured, well, they won't see me here, But then this light went a half circle around me over the canyon. Then I could see the shadow of the whole spacecraft, and that was just a light that was on the nose of it.
Okay. Ruben's going to pick up the story in a moment, but I just want to point out a couple of things he said. This small white light that you see in this drawing, that's the only point of light that he could see at first. So that's why he said he thought it was a tiny little orb. It was a tiny little ship of some kind. But as it got closer and as it circled around him and hovered over the canyon, over the ridge here, he could see that there was a hull, a slightly darkened outline of a hull. And at that point, these three windows represented here by rectangles, these three windows had not opened up yet. So the whole thing was dark except for the tiny point of light at the front. And so very interesting thing happened next, and Ruben will pick that up.
Want to go to the next little slide there? No, we good. Noe had mentioned earlier about the documentation that I had received based on this case, and back in 1965, Mr. Paul Cerny, who was with NICAP at the time, he was the principal investigator, and later he became a MUFON California director for Northern California, and then later he moved up the ranks. He passed away in the year 2000, and later I acquired a number of his cases, and when I was going through some of these cases, I looked at this one here and I said, my God, this is very interesting. I mean, this man went through a very challenging moment in his life with his encounter. And then when I talked to Noe, I said, hey, this is something really quite unique. But later, I never dreamed that I would be able to meet him in person and meet with his family. And he invited me over to stay over for a few days. And so I had the chance of looking at Paul Cerny's notes from nearly 30, 40 years ago at the time. And also we had the transcript and also a video, audio cassette. So I was able to formulate some of the same questions that he used, but added in a number of new questions. And we're real fortunate that, that his son, Dan Shrum, was able to videotape the interview. So what you're seeing tonight is the actual interview that was conducted with him. The extraordinary case. So as Noe was mentioning, he saw this dark object, and he started noticing these panels. And this was pretty much the angle of the approach of this strange craft that started to hover close to Don while Don was by the tree. So we can move on to.
Mr. Shrum actually did this.
Yeah, that's his. You're going to see some other of his drawings in the presentation. And this is the cylinder object that he saw very close, approaching the tree, and also he was able to see these panel of lights.
Very good representation.
It gives. Go ahead.
I just want to mention, we hired a friend of ours from Roswell, New Mexico, that we met in Roswell, Neil Reby, to do the illustrations for this book. And when Mr. Shrum first saw them, because Neil worked off of the descriptions that he gave of the beings, which you'll see in a minute, and the ships. And when Mr. Shrum first saw them, he was amazed because it was the closest, he said, that any artist had come to representing what he actually saw. So we were very happy that at the accuracy of Neil Reby's drawings.
Again, this is the flight path that Noe had described as it flew close to along the ridge and going close to where the trees are located at, where he was at. And of course, you could see that where it says the spaceship, the 3 panels and the light there. And we'll go on to the next.
This next section is interesting because, as Ruben mentioned, suddenly these 3 panels opened up on the hull of the ship. It had previously been dark, just kind of a dim outline, and the little point of light at the front. Then suddenly these 3 windows just opened up. The way Mr. Shrum described them, it was almost like they became, first they were like vertical slits, and then the slits opened into vertical horizontal windows. And out of the bottom part of the middle window came a smaller ship, which Mr. Shrum refers to as the scout ship, as we're going to hear here.
And then I saw 3 panels of light, like windows or whatever. And I saw a flash come from the bottom of the center one, and just saw a dark object go down in the canyon, and then I lost track of it. And then the next thing I saw a little blinking light up on the top of originally where the first one came from.
This object that you first saw that left the center panel, what did it look like, Don?
Well, at that time, all I saw was a flash and saw a dark object go down.
The dark object, what shape was it?
Well, I couldn't really say. It went so fast. But then I saw when it landed up on the ridge that I could see like a half. I could only see part of the top, but it had a little light on it, and looked like the top of a flying saucer that I'd seen in pictures.
Like a dome? Or?
Yes. yeah, like a dome. And then I kept my eyes on that.
So Ruben, tell us a little bit about what Mr. Shrum's emotions that he displayed during the interview.
Thank you, Noe. What really impressed me, and you could judge by yourself, is look at his body motions, and he's retelling his whole story back to me as if it was occurring to him right now. So be very, see his body language, and also the fact that he never deviated from the answers. That's the thing that really impressed us. We the same questions, and we asked questions in a different way, yet he was consistent. And that's what I felt his story was very credible, along with the other pieces of evidence that he had shared with us.
Okay, I'm trying to go in the right direction here. Here we go. And actually, that's a very good point that Ruben just made, because one of the things that I did, and I'm always quite the skeptic when we're approaching a case and thinking about doing a book. I took Ruben's videotaped interview that you're watching clips from right now, and I actually transcribed it. I sat there and I listened to the whole thing, and I transcribed it into words, into a text document. And I compared it with the statement that he gave NICAP investigator Paul Cerny back in 1965. And it matched with almost 100% in terms of the way he expressed what he saw, in terms of, how he expressed what he saw. It was amazing, the close correlation between the way back then and the interview you did in 2005, was it?
2005.
2005, so it was amazing. Okay, so what Mr. Shrum just said in the clip we just heard is that this huge mothership, 150-foot diameter ship, was hovering over the canyon near the tree that he was in, and the 3 vertical windows suddenly popped open, and out of the center one came the smaller ship, and Mr. Shrum was starting to get really terrified. The smaller ship flew past him and seemed to be going back in the direction that the large ship had come from in the first place. And he thought he saw it land in the distance. So that's a summary of what we just heard him say. Well, the next thing is, and the next amazing part of this is that a few moments after the landing of the smaller craft, he heard the trampling of something through the brush headed his way, as we're going to listen to in this next clip.
And then I heard some thrashing through the brush, and probably 5-10 minutes, these 2 humanoids come out of the brush, and they kind of broke some of the brush off, and was looking at it. And then they came straight underneath the tree and looked up at me. And I knew right then I was fingered.
They found you.
Yeah, they found me.
Can you describe them for us? That was briefly what they
Yeah, they looked like 4 or 5 feet. Of course, I'm looking down at them, so they'd be shorter than they probably are. And they had a silvery, like a one-piece suit on, and it seemed like it had the joints, puffy joints, on the shoulders and the elbows, and the legs I didn't see that clear.
The humanoids, were you able to see their faces?
No, it was just a kind of a dark shadow. I could see the 2 like eyes that were looked like welding goggles to me. They were the same as welding goggles. And then the rest of the face was kind of a blur. I couldn't see looking down at him.
You're able to see then, very, was it large or small? They're
About 2 inches in diameter. It reminded me, just like I said, like a welding goggle.
Did you want to add something to that?
I just was amazed again with his statement and his description of the face. And he says something really significant to us, which you'll hear later, those eyes. And those eyes really made a big impact on him, when we'll talk about how it affected him psychologically as well.
Okay, now Ruben's going to bring you this next part of the story, and that is a different kind of entity suddenly appeared on the scene shortly after the arrival of what Mr. Shrum refers to as the humanoids.
But what Don also described was another being that came following the humanoids. And he described it as almost robotic. And both Noe and I were really puzzled by that, but then again, it's really quite unique that we come across a case where, one, the humanoids are wearing some sort of suit with the puff elbow joints and that. And secondly, that they're using a robot, very type creature. And then we said, well, we use robots in our society. I mean, we can't live in our technology in many ways. How much is robotic technology used? And then we started thinking, well, why these certain beings are out there, they're explorers, and perhaps they're using robotic technology for their own means as well. So here's a description of what he provided for us, and then a really interesting sketch that he also did in the artist rendition on the bottom.
And then I saw two flashing red, orange light eyes coming, just picking its way down the ridge, just between the rocks and around them and everything, and come down and was on this big boulder, this big flat rock, and then he kind of looked up at me, and he moved his hand in this through the fires, cinders, and kind of scattered them.
and the eyes of this other creature, like the robot. What did that look like to you?
And it had kind of like fire. It's kind of a orangish, reddish orange, or yellowish orange, and it kind of flickered like fire. And they're about the same diameter as, about 2 inches in diameter as the humanoids.
I want to add one thing. Is in studying the transcripts of Mr. Shrum's interviews back in '65, and also going over Ruben's interview with him and the other material that he and his family provided to us for the book, Mr. Shrum says in several places that he's not completely sure that this was a robot. It could have been one of the humanoids in a different type of suit, in a bulkier suit that made it look more robotic. So whether these were two distinctive types of entities or whether it was the same entity with a different outer covering, he wasn't completely certain about. It could be that what he refers to as a robot may have had a different type of suit on that was specially adapted for use in a different way. So that is possible. But nevertheless, his impression at the time in the field, when he was in the middle of experiencing this, was that it was two different type of beings. Well, perhaps the special adaptation of this suit or of this creature was that it had offensive capabilities. It was able to launch an assault or an attack, because that's exactly what happened next. Although Mr. Shrum had been concerned at the initial appearance of these two types of entities, he really didn't feel really threatened until this next event occurred, and that is that this robotic-like creature positioned itself right at the base of the tree. It lifted up one hand and seemed to be fidgeting with something on the underside of its helmet or its head covering, and then a shot of vapor went up into the tree right at Mr. Shrum, as we'll hear in this next clip.
Then he come down up on the rock. He was about 7 feet from me. And then he touched his mouth, and the kind of a steam vapor come out of his mouth, and it lit up his face so I could see some detail. And then I blacked out when that steam hit me, or I guess it was kind of took the air from me. And I'd gasp for air and then black out. And I fell over my bow. That's the only thing that kept me in the tree. And then, so I figured they were out to get me then.
And that is, you know, he was very frightened. And when you shared that story with us, the way how this robotic-like creature was emitting gas, then what we're looking at is some sort of asphyxiant that it's replacing oxygen. And he said it was odorless, but he'll share with us later some of the other physical effects that this also had on him.
As we mentioned earlier, the only method of defense that he had at his disposal was his bow and his arrows. He had a 60-pound bow, and when you let off an arrow using that type of bow, it has as much energy and kick to it as a rifle shot. So, I mean, low tech, yes, but then again, it had some power behind it. So, and what's interesting is, you know, in recent years, there have been a number of books and shows done about if the Earth were ever to be invaded by a race with a superior technology to ours, that probably our best bet would be to go low tech in fighting back, in mounting a rebellion. Because the creatures or the superior race would be expecting a technological battle against them. And so turning to basically sticks and stones might be the way to catch them off guard. Several researchers have suggested. In Mr. Shrum's case, he didn't have a choice because that's all the weapons that he had at his disposal. And we're going to listen to him tell this next intriguing part of the story. And by the way, keep in mind that there was physical evidence here that the arrows were recovered after this incident. They ended up at the desk of Mr. J. Allen Hynek, and the Air Force looked into those arrows. They kept promising to return the arrowheads to Mr. Shrum, and they never did.
How often do you hear that over and over?
So I had a 60-pound bow, which is a very high velocity, and I shot, seeing as how the robot's the only thing that was causing me harm, I shot the chest area, and it has the velocity of a rifle at that distance, because I'm only about 7-8 feet from him. And when I hit the chest, the sparks would fly like electrical, like an arc welder kind of. And then that robot backed up and almost knocked him down. He kind of fell back against a rock, and the two at the bottom took off and headed for the brush and stood out there about 30 feet from me. And then I shot 2 more arrows, and it was about the same time sequence that these 2 humanoids would, every time I'd shoot, they'd go back up into the brush, just almost out of sight from me.
I wanted to point out that you all have probably noticed from listening to Mr. Shrum's interview so far that he is a really no-nonsense guy. He tells you everything in nuts and bolts terms. He doesn't speculate. He never speculated as to the origin or the philosophy or the purpose of these entities that he encountered. He's not the kind. He leaves that to others. He's just simply describing the experience that he underwent. And then later on, we'll talk about the tremendous impact it had in his life and in his family's life for years to come. But he's a very down-to-earth, nuts and bolts. This is what happened. This is what I did next. This is what happened after I did that. And Ruben is the one who you were really impressed with his credibility and his the way he explained things.
Yes, and one of the questions, I think we'll come to it very shortly, is I asked him the question. I said, how come you didn't shoot your arrows at the humanoids? And he basically said, they wouldn't bother me. It's the robot. So that's why he shot the arrows at the robot. And here's a picture when I was at his home, and he's showing me the bow and some of the arrows that he had used. And so you could see the power and how, the length of this bow here inside his home. Oh, move on. And as Noe had said, he's a no-nonsense guy, but he's also a hunter. He's an experienced hunter, and he used everything at his disposal. He's very, very quick-wit is basically, yes, in order to fight off the attack. So he'll describe what he did in order to save himself.
Let me just add that the fight he put up with the very little things that he had at his disposal was just amazing to us. The way he thought of things that he could do. And toward the end, we're going to show you, this was made into a TV show for a Jack Webb production in the early 70s called Project UFO, also called Project Blue Book. And you'll see the part where he's trying to work out, he's trying to burn the brush down at the base of the tree to scare off the aliens. But anyway, what we found most amazing is the quick-witted response to everything that these creatures were throwing at him. And we're going to start off by having him explain how he thought of things to do to try to hold them off.
Then I ran out of arrows, so I only had 3 left. And I thought, well, that's when pomade hair, it was just, I mean, the cap I had on was just soaked with oil.
This is for your hair?
Yeah, from my hair, yeah, pomade. And I always carried all kinds of books of matches with me when I hunted. And so I lit that cap and it just blazed up, and I dropped it down the base of the tree. And just in that instant, they moved back about 12, 15 feet. And I glanced over at the ship that was over the canyon, kind of almost level with me. And it was almost out of sight. It was just like a star. It moved that fast.
Wow.
Just in that second. So then I got the idea that they're scared of fire. So I burned everything but my t-shirt and my jeans. And come to find out later on that it was 32 degrees out, and I was shaking and kind of overexposed for the weather. And at one time I had a bunch of change, and I threw it down, and they all kind of gathered around it. Well, after I shot or started burning stuff and throwing it down, and I even tied some of my shirt that I ripped up to a compass so I could try to hit some brush, because there wasn't nothing right underneath the tree. And then I caught a little pile of brush on fire. I figured that would bring the cavalry. That when I run out of stuff to burn, I headed for the top of the tree. And then it was a pretty sparse tree. I could see down to the ground. And I broke off the top and threw it down. And anytime I'd throw down or shake the tree, these humanoids would back up.
He told us an interesting story about what the aliens did with the change. Remember that, Ruben? You want to tell him that?
Yeah. When he went later on in the story, when they left, he did go down and was looking for the change and couldn't find any. And he realized, he said, well, perhaps they're using the change as a way of understanding our history, our culture. And so that was just one interesting thought. He also threw his canteen, I think you'll see it there in a moment, at the beings, and I had a chance to hold it, and he said that the being was holding the canteen and then later threw it back on the ground. So I was just wondering, I said, gee, when he showed me the canteen, I thought, wow, I'm holding a canteen that was touched by another being. Obviously, he decided not to take it, but he still has it, and I just thought it was really interesting. But there's other interesting aspects to the story, as we'll get into.
Okay, so this struggle has been going on now. It started at around dusk, or shortly after dusk, and it has been going on quite a long time, and it actually ended up going on all night until the following morning. So, well, one of the interesting questions that Ruben asked, and you'll hear Ruben's voice asking in a moment, what were there sounds that Mr. Shrum heard during this encounter? And by the way, before we get to the sounds, I want to show you this. This is a drawing that Mr. Shrum did later. It's barely discernible, but this is a representation of him sitting on one of the branches of the tree, and this is the bow. You've got this huge, what he called a mothership, hovering nearby, you've got the robotic type creature here and the humanoids here. And this is a ravine or a canyon. And then this was a sketch that he did also later in the year 2000. You'll see that the two creatures are sort of similar in a lot of ways. And when Mr. Shrum was showing us this picture, he once again remarked that he wasn't completely sure if this was just a different type of suit. You know, it could have been the same creature, just in a different type of suit. So now we get to this strange sounds, because a lot of UFO incidents include audio input of different kinds. And so Ruben's question was what he heard, and he made a very interesting observation, as we're about to hear.
Did you hear any noise between them, any communication? Was there any?
You know, I heard kind of a cooing or almost like an owl, but it could have been an owl, you know, that up there, but it just kind of fit in with them.
So when you heard this owl-like sound, what did they do?
Well, they'd go on about their business, you know, what they were, but they would try to climb up the tree. They're trying to boost each other up the tree, and then when I would, that's why I know I wasn't out very long at a time, because when I'd throw something down or when I was being gassed, they'd step back from the tree, and then they'd be, when I'd come to, I'd have dry heaves and kind of gasp for air, and they'd just be trying to climb back up on the tree. So that gave me a time that I wasn't out very long.
Okay, so Ruben was explaining a while ago about how apparently this was some kind of asphyxiant that he was being subjected to. And what an asphyxiant does is it sucks up all the oxygen around you, and it causes you to go into oxygen deprivation for a short while, and then it would cause him to momentarily pass out. But he was thinking that those effects weren't lasting very long, because he would come back, he would regain consciousness and catch the humanoids trying to climb the tree again and take measures against that. Did you have a comment on that, Ruben? Or on the sounds?
Well, again, on the sounds, it was interesting how there was a communication going on, and also between the beings, and then also the ship would respond.
That's right.
And so so the ship would move in different directions, and so we thought that there must be a form of communication between the beings and the mother ship. Also, Noe had mentioned the asphyxiant, the fact that he was able to, when he recovered, he said that, again, he could see the beings were trying to climb up. And the question that we deal with a lot is, well, I mean, why couldn't they get them down in another way? You know, or a zap gun or whatever, if they really wanted them. And of course, we can't answer that. We don't know what the agenda was. The fact that maybe the humanoids were explorers of some sort, and the fact they discovered a human being up in a tree, how intriguing that was, how easily of a target. So it leaves a lot of thought. That
Remember, tell him about how before they came toward him, they were looking at the brush and cutting
Yes.
out pieces of it.
Yes, thank you, Noe. And you know, I've run across this too, and other descriptions where they seem to be interested in the plant life, the fauna, and the animal life that we have, especially. And I've heard a very similar, they're interested, they're almost like scientists, they're gathering samples. I've heard these stories from other encounters with other people who said, it's not like they're really paying attention to them, they're more interested in what the geography is and then the collection of the animal and plant samples that are there.
Yeah, Mr. Shrum said both in the 65 interview and in the more recent interviews, he said that he noticed when the humanoids first appeared that they were very interested in the surrounding brush, the surrounding trees, and it was like they were examining the leaves on the plants, and they were being, making a careful study as they worked their way down. So,
I forgot to mention something. Also, to go along with that, the fact that these, just speculation, that the fact that these beings were wearing these suits, so it's almost like a biohazard suit. Perhaps they're using that to protect them, but also to not cross-contaminate the life forms that are there, which many of our scientists do as well. We take extreme measures whenever we send robotic explorers. They go through this whole phase of sterilization to make sure that we're not contaminating that planet with any known virus from this planet.
that's a good point. Also, one other thing I wanted to mention about the robotic type beings that I didn't think of earlier is people always ask us, have there been other UFO incidents where robots are seen? So Ruben and I did a little research into the literature, and we found, sure enough, that there are a large number of historic UFO cases that involve beings that appear to be robotic. And some of the more familiar cases, for example, would be the Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction of Hickson and Parker, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker in 1973, was it? That's a very famous case, and Hickson and Parker described the creatures that came out of the ship and grabbed them and floated them back into the vessel as being robotic appearing. But there are many other cases besides the Pascagoula case where, and we also found comments in the UFO research literature from researchers who say that it makes perfect sense that robots or automated beings would be sent to gather samples and to do other routine missions.
I was wondering if you could share too what Travis Walton shared with us about the gas, the similarity that he was.
Yeah, in the Travis Walton encounter, and at the very end, right before he found himself regaining consciousness down below, back on Earth on the street, the entities on board that ship, before releasing him, they put some kind of mask on him, and they used some kind of vapor to temporarily black him out. So, and not only that, there were some other similarities, and one of the things that I've heard Travis say is what really struck him about the entities that he saw on board the ship were the eyes, that they somehow he fixated on the eyes, and that also happened with the Shrum case. And what's also very interesting, we've mentioned 3 very big UFO cases. We've mentioned, of course, the Shrum case, but also the Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction of Hickson and Parker, and we've also mentioned the Travis Walton abduction. These 3 were studied by a lot of the same researchers, Dr. James Harder, Dr. James Allen Hynek, Jim and Coral Lorenzen. I mean, some of the top people in the field at that time. And it's interesting that they all worked on these cases together, and they were all involved, and they all thought very highly of these cases. So we go on. So the story of the encounter part now is starting to wrap up. He's been in the tree for hours. He's been repeatedly being gassed. He's been repeatedly fighting back. the efforts by these entities apparently to retrieve him as undamaged as possible for whatever purpose we don't know, or he didn't know. And then they try a new strategy at the very climax of the story. They try a new strategy which they haven't tried before. Another robot appears, and he goes up and stands facing the first robot right at the base of the tree, and this weird energy passes between the two creatures, and a huge cloud of vapor goes up into the tree, as we're about to hear Mr. Shrum say here.
After I went to the top of the tree, I had a military belt, and I moved it out to the last hitch and put it around me and the tree. So in case I did get gassed, they wouldn't, I wouldn't fall down. And then, like I said, I threw change down and everything to try to distract them. And then finally, these two humanoids stepped back from the tree, and another robot came, and there was two just about the same place that the two humanoids were. And they stood facing each other, and flames just like lightning, and it real bright, and it just came between them. And then the gas was so thick coming up the tree that it would dissipate just about the time I got to me. But then that's when I'd start gasp for air, and then when I woke up from that, it was light, but the sun hadn't come up yet. And I was just hanging by my belt, my head down, my feet down, and they were gone. Well, I knew I made it. I lived through the night.
Just to go back, did you fall asleep, or this gas, did it overwhelm you?
Yeah, that's when it completely engulfed the whole tree and got up to me, and I don't know how long I was out, but it was just you could see just a dim glow of the sun on the clouds and stuff, not clouds, but in the sky. And then when I woke up, it was light, but the sun hadn't come up yet.
All right, this was the period of time that Mr. Shrum was extremely worried about. What had happened from the time that he was gassed the final time, and he was unconscious for a much larger time than he had been ever before. And then the next thing he knew, it was nearly dawn, and the creatures were gone. So what happened during this missing time? And that was weighed very heavily on him.
Yes, it weighed a lot on him, as Noe was saying. What could they have done? Did they have access to him? And with Paul Cerny, they also had a hypnotist that worked with him. And through the sessions that he went through, it appeared that nothing happened to him physically, but there was still a lot of scarring emotionally to him, which you'll see here very, very shortly.
He was greatly relieved after he underwent regressive hypnotherapy, and he recalled a lot of things about the incident that he hadn't previously been able to remember. I remember him telling us about, for example, he remembers childlike footprints all around the base of the tree, and moccasin-like. And he hadn't remembered that, consciously, but it came out in his hypnotherapy. He also, he had never been clear about the massive size of the ship he described as a mothership. But after he underwent hypnotherapy, he was able to determine that it was at least 150 feet in diameter. So that's a huge object. So he remembered little things that he hadn't been able to bring up. But there was no recollection of being anywhere other than on the tree, ever. There was no recollection that the beings ever reached him, ever got him, took him somewhere, and then brought him back. That was the part that was really concerning him for many years afterward, until he had the hypnotherapy. So this was a very nice rendition done by Neil Reeby of Mr. Shrum waking up in the morning, just hanging by his belt from the tree. We're going to talk briefly about the role of the other two hunters in this case, Mr. Vincent Alvarez and Mr. Tim Trueblood. Mr. Alvarez, unfortunately, is deceased. However, right after the incident, but by the way, let me back up. Both of them had a part in it. In the sense that when Mr. Shrum stumbled back to camp, he made it back to the base camp the following morning and reunited with his two friends. But when he showed up back at camp, they both saw how distressed he was. They saw that he had been through a tremendously traumatic event. They saw his disheveled appearance, the fact that a lot of his clothes were missing. He had burned them and thrown them down to the base of the tree. And they experienced his shakiness and his mannerism of being that of a person who had been through an extremely difficult event. But also, Mr. Alvarez, shown in the picture up at the top, upper left, Mr. Alvarez filled out a written affidavit, notarized written affidavit, stating that he saw the initial appearance of the mothership, the larger ship, coming down out of the Earth's atmosphere and zooming past him, going to a point farther into the forest, which he didn't know at the time was where Mr. Shrum was. So Mr. Alvarez witnessed the arrival and appearance of the ship. Mr. Trueblood never gave a formal statement of any kind other than to say that he saw how visibly distraught Mr. Shrum was after his incident. Our efforts to contact Mr. Trueblood were unsuccessful. He had psychological problems, we understand, psychiatric problems after the incident, and became reclusive and moved to Hawaii at one point, and we were never able to locate him after that. So unfortunately, we don't have a true corroborating testimony from Mr. Trueblood, although we do have a signed, notarized affidavit from Mr. Alvarez. And by the way, this is the original map, which was done right after the encounter by Mr. Shrum, unaltered, with his own highlighting, and he marked the path of the spaceship in red. He underlined the parts that he thought were important, and so he drew this map right after the encounter. Did you want to add something? Okay. And then the Air Force became involved. We all know how those things turn out. As it happens, Mr. Shrum came back home. His entire family saw how distraught and stressed he was. They were very worried about possible radiation exposure. He underwent some health checks, and he was trying to get himself seen to be checked for radiation. So they were trying to do all this stuff, and then at the same time they were trying to decide whether or not to tell anyone outside of the immediate family what had happened to him. And Mr. Schrum and his wife were very concerned because he worked at a very highly secure facility, which was the Aerojet missile plant in Sacramento, the top U.S. government missile facility of that time. So, so in the end, it ended up being that Mr. Schrum's name was never released, never associated with this case until many, many years later. When the first reports of this, he did eventually report it to NICAP and other UFO researchers, but he asked that his name not be used. Now, those of us who are familiar with UFO cases know that having an anonymous principal witness is pretty much the kiss of death for a UFO story. And people always ask us, why isn't this story as well known as, for example, Pascagoula or Travis Walton? Well, that was one of the reasons, is it didn't receive as much attention because the witness shielded himself behind the anonymity that he felt was required to keep his job with the government. And so that's the reason that the case, although it was very highly regarded by the top UFO researchers of the time, it was called one of the best cases we've ever looked at by Jim and Coral Lorenzen. It was highly regarded by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Dr. James Harder, and others. It really didn't go out to the public all that much. But one of the things that they did do right after the incident was Mr. Schrum's mother had taken some classes at the local community college, and she knew an astronomer in the Sacramento area. So they decided to contact this astronomer. Well, astronomers might be good at mapping out stars and constellation, but the concept of UFOs kind of blows most of their minds, you know. So what he did was he turned around and called the local military base, the Air Force base. And so before they knew it, they had the Air Force knocking on their door. And we're going to hear Mr. Schrum talk about what happened.
Then what happened afterwards, Don? How did you talk to anyone else about your...
Well, my family, I told them. And then the only outside person at that time was a professor at one of the colleges. And my mother-in-law had gone, it was her professor when she was younger. So we told him the story, and he's the one that contacted the Air Force.
So what happened there, Don, with the Air Force?
Well, they made an appointment with two representatives of the Air Force, and they tried to disillusion me. They said, well, you know, the Japanese might have had somebody up there, you know, they were still, you know, and they said there was Boy Scouts dressed up, you know, in costume just to scare somebody. And I said, yeah, I'm sure they're going to spend all night and keep a guy in a tree, you know. And, then they said, well, the Army probably bivouacked up there and it was in a training camp. So my father-in-law was in the Air Force. So he called and found out there was no military in that area for any reason, because it was a pretty desolate area. And they tried to disillusion me in every way they could. And they took the Arrowhead, the main one, and they said, well, we'll get back to you and you can have this back as soon as we get through with it, which I never did. But when I went back up there during rifle season, I found the other arrow, the third one.
Third one. You found two then, and then you found the
Yeah.
other one.
And when we went back, the area had been raked. There's an area probably 50 feet around that tree, and there was cigarette packages and cigar butts, and so I know the Air Force checked it out pretty good.
That explains.
And they had an easy way to find it, because there's an orange circle around that tree where I'd caught little fires,
All right.
and it was showing orange, so they had no problem finding it. And I marked on the map that they had where it was, the location.
So actually, Mr. Shrum had given them this map. And so the Air Force, while they were playing the game of, well, you know, what actually happened to you was a bunch of Boy Scouts dressed up in costumes. And, you know, they were playing that game with them, and then they actually sent apparently a large group of men down there to totally clean up the area and rake the soil, clean of any remaining evidence. So that was the game that they played with him. And one of the things he didn't mention in the clip, but he told us, and it's in the book, was the initial intimidation session that he had. This is a representation that Neil Reeby did based on the testimony of Mr. Shrum. This tough-looking officer that you see standing in the back, and then this interrogation technician with the large reel-to-reel tape recorder that you see sitting. They were the ones, they scheduled an interview at some off-base housing at which Air Force base was it, do you remember? McClellan. And so this was off-base housing. It was an empty apartment or an empty house. So the Shrums walked in there and they saw this barren house. And about the only thing that was in there was this table and chairs. And Mrs. Shrum, I remember Mrs. Shrum telling us that she was very disturbed. She got very negative feeling being in that house. And that's when these men came on very strong with their strange attempt to explain away Mr. Shrum's experience. So Mr. Shrum's rest of his life actually has been very much affected by what happened that evening, as has his family's. We recently did an interview on the radio with Mr. Dan Shrum, who is Mr. Shrum's son. And he talked on the radio show, it was a Jeff Rentz program. He talked about how it was growing up with this always in the background. With the parents tried to shield the younger kids from what had happened to Mr. Shrum, and yet every time that there would be a gathering of the older relatives, he would hear Mr. Shrum and his uncles and aunts, they're talking about it. There's this buzz. And then as he got older, Dan heard more and more of the story. And eventually, he asked his dad, and his dad told him the whole story. And then it was actually Dan Shrum who was behind the camera when Ruben did this interview that we're watching parts of tonight. So anyway, the whole family was affected, and Mr. Shrum had some additional strange incidents that happened to him that led him to believe that he was somehow being tracked. We're going to go more into detail about this in a little bit. Ruben, do you want to talk a little bit about how he acted when you talked to him about the after effects before we hear the clip?
Yeah, that was the thing that I was really quite interested in knowing is how was he able to cope And as Noe's mentioned, it has affected him and his family for many years. And the fact that you'll hear him say the eyes, but also he had a will to fight. And that fight was basically he had a 2-year-old daughter. He just got recently married, and that was his purpose for fighting. I mean, he had thought of committing suicide and just jumping off that tree, falling down into the canyon. But then he realized, no, he says, I can't, I have my child and my wife. And also, he shared with us some other effects that this had on him. So.
Yeah, we're going to go more into length, but first let's hear Mr. Shrum.
I'd like to go there. I just wanted to ask you, how has this affected you? Did you have any nightmares or any?
Well, for a year, I had, screaming nightmares. I'd wake up yelling, those eyes, and I'd be just a cold sweat, just be drenched with sweat. And I even thought about, when I was up in the top of that tree, I thought about just jumping off and jumping down the canyon and just killing myself. But the only thing that kept me going is I had the little girl, my wife, and that kept me fighting.
So as we mentioned, there were some after effects, and in the years after the sighting, Mr. Shrum developed this strange physical sensation that he would experience quite often. He described it as a buzzing in his ears. And any time that he felt this buzzing, he interpreted that to mean that they were close by. So Mrs. Shrum told us that she would often wake up in the middle of the night and she would see Mr. Shrum standing or sitting near the window of their bedroom looking out up at the stars, and he would tell her that he had been awakened by this buzzing sensation in his ears. So the other interesting story that they told us is that once during a camping trip, and going along with the Shrums were some other family members, and so they took this camping trip, and they were all gathered around the campsite, the campfire, one evening, and Mrs. Shrum noticed that Mr. Shrum was kind of holding his ears and looking somewhat disturbed. And he was feeling that buzzing effect, he later told her. And then everybody in the group that was watching Mr. Shrum saw him turn around 180 degrees, turn his body, and look up toward a point in a nearby ridge, a tree line above a ridge. And he was looking there at least 2 or 3 minutes before they saw several objects come zooming past above that tree line and overhead, 2 UFOs zooming past them. So at that, what seems obvious there is that Mr. Shrum somehow had a precognition that this sighting was about to happen. So, oh yes, now we get a little fun time here. As we mentioned, Mr. Shrum's story was not well known throughout the 60s and 70s because of the fact that he was an anonymous witness. He didn't want his name used. He resisted a lot of publicity about the case. And really, his story never really had come out in full until we worked with him to publish the book after Ruben did his interview with him. But back in May 7th, 1978, a very enterprising television producer-director named Jack Webb, you may have heard of him, he did Dragnet and Adam 12. What else did he do?
He did a movie. I'm trying to.
He did movies. Anyway, he had a brainstorm to do a series based on the Project Blue Book cases. Now, what's interesting about this series is that it was very much done from a skeptical perspective. The underlying thesis, it becomes clear from watching several episodes of this series, the underlying thesis is that UFOs always have some kind of rational explanation that doesn't have to do with extraterrestrials or anything. So it's very downbeat in terms of stressing the possibility of contact with ETs in reality. But interestingly enough, some of the articles that were out there in the UFO literature about Mr. Shrum's case that had been put out by people like the Lorenzens and Dr. Harder and so forth, some of those found their way across Jack Webb's desk, apparently. And he included it in his Project UFO TV show, which was also known as Project Blue Book, although the Shrum case was not included in any of the officially released Project Blue Book files. So as far as Project Blue Book, they supposedly never looked at it. Yet we know that those two men that came to interview Mr. Shrum, he assumed they were from the local Air Force Base, McClellan, and they met right outside the base in the base housing. But they had actually come, later it was found out through a Freedom of Information Act request, that they had been dispatched from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So why would they come from Wright-Patterson to talk to somebody in Sacramento about something that they didn't believe really happened? And by the way, the case ended up being marked as psychological problem.
By the Air Force.
By the Air Force. Anyway, so Jack Webb thought this case apparently was intriguing enough to include a version of it, a Hollywoodized version of it. And I told Ruben, when we decided to show you this video clip from the show, I told Ruben, we're going to show it at the very end after we've told them the complete story as it actually happened, because this is a very watered down and TV drama formatted version. So keep that in mind and don't be expecting that this is going to be a faithful representation of the actual case, but it's interesting and it does capture some of the tension that Mr. Shrum felt, and it gives you a little bit of the flavor of it. So we'll go ahead with that here. I'm going to start off by showing you the introduction to the series, which is that narrator is Jack Webb in the introduction?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounded like Jack. So here we go. Creepy music.
Ezekiel saw the wheel. This is the wheel he said he saw. These are unidentified flying objects that people say they are seeing now. Are they proof that we are being visited by civilizations from other stars? Or just what are they? The United States Air Force began an investigation of this high strangeness in a search for the truth. What you are about to see is part of that 20-year search.
Man, I thought I left all this back in basic training. Well, we're here. This is the place. This is where I saw everything. Like I told you, I was hunting with a couple of buddies from work, and we got separated. It started to get dark, and I just kind of lost my orientation.
I don't blame you. I've been confused ever since we left the road.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, Sergeant. One of the reasons they call this area Devil's Lake is because of so many people getting lost up here. things are familiar, and then again they're not. I've been hunting in this area since I was 15 years old. I hunt with bow and arrow. I never carry a gun.
But you were lost.
Yes, Major, I was. But like I said, I had enough sense to stay put and build a campfire. I was just about to settle down until morning. That is, until I heard this weird throbbing sound.
Hey, that's not bad for 1978. They didn't like the cylindrical shape, though, of the real story, so they went with a triangular. And ladies and gentlemen, Robbie the Robot. They were on a tight budget, and Robbie was available in the back lot, so anybody ever watch Mystery Science Theater? I think this would have been a good one. I like the exposed brain circuitry. Shake the tree. And now Ruben's favorite part. Watch the robot carefully. He's a fire extinguisher. All right, we want to spare you any further pain. I think you get an idea. It kind of trivializes what we felt was a very tremendous case. What are just some of the things that where this totally deviated from the story that we told you earlier? I want to hear some of your comments. What did they change, obviously, for the wrong? Everything. Other than everything. Just call it out. The saucer, the representation of the saucer. So the robot using the Robbie retrofitted from Fantastic Planet. Mr. Shrum was not on the ground when the object landed, and they totally ignored the humanoids. They only represented the robots, and that's all they did. The vapor, it wasn't used to put out the fire, it was used to put out Mr. Shrum, or to try to. The robot didn't shake the tree. Mr. Shrum shook the tree to keep the humanoids from climbing up. Lots of things. Well, anyway, this is what happens when Hollywood gets a hold of anything. Should we say that with Sony Studios being right next door? Yeah.
Let's hope Sony will do the real thing. But
Okay, we're gonna come back.
Go ahead.
We're gonna take a break, and then we're gonna come back and show you what Cisco Grove's, right where this incident happened, what it looks like now, because a friend of ours just went there last weekend, July 5th. We're gonna show video and still pictures of the site, the way it looks right now, and then we'll take some Q&A. Thank you, Yvonne.
Wow. So far, thank you guys. This is fantastic. Thank you. Yes, give them a big hand. I heard them, was it last year, guys? You were on Coast to Coast about the aliens in the forest when your book came out? And I heard them on Coast to Coast. I don't know how many here heard them being interviewed on Coast to Coast about this case. And while I was listening to Coast, I went on Amazon and ordered the book and read it immediately. It was fantastic. Before we go on about a 10-minute break, I will also want to recognize our security detail, Scott Belanda and Vaughn Fulkerson. You guys are doing a great job. Thank you. And I think I saw one of our board members sneak in here. John Elias, are you in the room? He is in the building. John Elias, stand up. He does our marketing and promotion. It's good to see you, John. And afterwards, we all go down to Denny's if we want to do a little late night dining on Jefferson. And we have, where is Sotero in the room? Sotero Delgado, is he in the room? He was gracious enough, he's a CERO member, and gracious enough to pay the rental fee for the private room at Denny's. So that's where we go if anybody wants to continue the conversation afterwards. So please check out our raffle table. We've got some fantastic baskets. And also, Noe, you're gonna donate one of the posters, a signed poster from this case. We're going to raffle that off too. So get your raffle tickets. This helps us. Your entrance fee, the raffle tickets helps us bring in speakers like Noe and Ruben and Grant Cameron in September. So we appreciate your. Oh, and we have another DVD thrown in too. The donations are wonderful. Anyway, 10 minutes and we'll get back, and then we're going to have the raffle and then back to this wonderful presentation. I couldn't see the clock. I'm kind of like, that was kind of interesting, huh? Hey, how are you? Oh, no. I've got some copies here. I don't know, yeah, I don't know if they're, let's see.
Good. Well, that's the